At this time, I'd like to give a proper introduction to our speakers here this evening. Scott LaMar, many of you know him. He is the host and executive producer of the daily Smart Talk News and Public Affairs program on 89.5 and 93.3. Previously, LaMar was WITF TV's senior public affairs producer and produced the station's award-winning weekly public affairs TV program. LaMar has won more than a dozen Pennsylvania Associated Press Broadcast Awards since 2000 and has been nominated for five Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards. And most recently, LaMar has received the recipient of the American Society of Civil Engineers National 2020 Excellence in Journalism Award. So congrats to Scott. Our author here this evening is the best-selling Erik Larson. He is the author of 5 national bestsellers: Dead Wake, In the Garden of Beasts, Thunderstruck, The Devil in the White City, and Isaac Storm, which have collectively sold more than 9 million copies. His books have been published in nearly 20 countries. Of course, the book we are here for is titled The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. You've all heard the praise. It was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. It's received rave reviews from NPR, Vanity Fair, O Magazine, the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and many, many other outlets and authors. Maybe most importantly, it's one of my favorite books of the year, so you got to buy it. Huge thank you to Erik and his publisher, Penguin Random House, for helping coordinate this event. And a special thank you to Scott for joining us and being such a strong advocate for literature and the bookstore. At this time, I'll hand it over to Erik Larson and Scott LaMar. Enjoy, everyone.
Alex, thank you very much. And Erik, of course, thank you. Welcome to Harrisburg. Author of the
Virtual Harrisburg.
Virtual Harrisburg, yeah. And I'm not even really in Harrisburg. The station is located just outside the city. The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. What inspired you to write about Churchill? And especially, you narrowed it down to about a year from the time that Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain to a year later. What inspired you?
It wasn't Churchill per se that drew me to do this book. I'm always drawn by the story, and then the characters define themselves as I go along. In this case, I had become intrigued with the idea of how on earth did people endure the Blitz and the 6 months of bombing that came after it. I mean, we're talking about the Blitz, we're talking about 57 consecutive nights of bombing by the German Luftwaffe, another 6 months of raids at intervals, intensifying raids at intervals. And I started thinking, how on earth did anybody survive that? And how did they go about enduring it on a day-to-day basis? I initially thought maybe I would try to find a typical London family and portray that family. Then I thought, why not do the quintessential London family, Churchill and his family and his close advisors? And so that's how the story came to be. It wasn't necessarily an intrinsic interest in Churchill, although of course I find him a fascinating man. And now even more after I've finished the book, I find that to be the case. It is often the case, by the way, for me that when I write about characters, I often end up not liking them. But in this case, I actually really like Churchill.
Churchill, from reading the book, embodies what we think of as a leadership, not just in wartime, but anytime. He had courage to make tough decisions. He inspired people to follow him. Now, it helped that he was a great speaker, a great orator, and that he had charisma. But it seems as though we're missing those kind of leaders today. Talk about his leadership qualities.
Yeah, the thing that made Churchill, a lot of elements made him a great leader. But the thing that I really like to focus on is the fact that Churchill had a deep understanding of the power of symbolic acts, how important it was basically to walk the talk. When I say symbolic acts, I mean even something on the minor end of the scale, just the fact that he refused to identify Hitler by name. He would refer to him as that man, or that wicked man, in his speeches and his correspondence and so forth. When you think about it, that's in itself kind of a clever thing, because if you refuse to identify somebody by name, you kind of undercuts the scariness of that person. It's kind of like Voldemort in Harry Potter. You're not supposed to talk about it, but in this case, it's like by not identifying Hitler by name, he was diminishing him in some way. But then you go to the other end of the scale, And you have moments like after the first deliberate intensive raid against London on September 7, 1940, you have him walking in the docks area of London, which had been badly blasted by the Luftwaffe, and he's walking among the people, and this was incredibly encouraging to those people who've been bombed out of their homes. It wasn't clear at first that would be the case. When Churchill drove up with his advisors, one of his advisors was very concerned that this might go very bad because the people might be feeling, well, why didn't you protect us? It was exactly the opposite. They were so glad to see Churchill. And he continued this practice of visiting bombed out areas. But he always tried to be seen doing something that was brave and defiant. I mean, for example, this is a guy who, when air raids occurred, he was much more likely to go to the nearest rooftop than to hide in the cellar. And in fact, there's one great scene, one of my favorite scenes, is there was a quite intensive raid. He was having a dinner party. And of course, as one does, he invites his guests up onto the rooftop to watch with him. And as this raid is unfolding, as this horror is unfolding London, he quotes, he has the presence of mind to quote Tennyson. He quotes a poem by Tennyson called Locksley Hall, considered by many to have been a poem that foresaw the advent of aerial warfare. So you think about this, I mean, here's a guy who goes up onto a rooftop during a raid and has the presence of mind to quote Tennyson. That is a rare guy.
You might be able to tell, and I'm speaking to the audience, that Churchill was a little bit eccentric just by that example of going on the roof during a bombing, and I say a bombings, because it happened more than once. Talk about his eccentricities. He really was kind of a different guy.
Well, he was. I mean, one of the things that surprised me and that really endeared Churchill to me, as well as honestly to his very hardworking staff, was the fact that Churchill was a lot of fun. He had a very lively side to him. For example, he loved to sing. His favorite song was Run, Rabbit, Run, 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 Run. I think I have the number of runs correct. We had to go around and around with my fact checker and my copy editor to determine exactly the number of runs in that refrain. But he loved Run, Rabbit, Run. He loved the songs from The Wizard of Oz. He loved Gilbert Sullivan. He loved to dance. And one other of my favorite scenes is that there was a dinner party at Chequers, which is the prime ministerial estate in the countryside outside London. And that's sort of a character in the book, honestly. I was enthralled with Chequers. And Churchill brought dozens of guests to this place and had these fabulous dinner parties. So after one of these dinner parties, though, with all these guests arrayed around in the so-called Great Hall at Chequers, Churchill puts on the gramophone, puts on some martial music, and proceeds to do bayonet drills with his Mannlicher rifle with a bayonet attached. While he is wearing his blue siren suit, his light blue siren suit, that is a one-piece, essentially a jumpsuit that he designed so that it could be pulled on at a moment's notice. And over that, he's wearing a gold silk dragon nightgown, not nightgown, robe, dressing gown. And he proceeds to do these bayonet drills in all seriousness, dead serious, in the Great Hall at Chequers after this dinner party. And his guests were just doubled over with laughter because this was hilarious. But he had a real sense of fun.
He also bathed twice a day, took 2 baths a day,
Yep.
took a nap at least once a day. But I want to go to the end of the book for you to describe the scene. After Churchill finally met Franklin Roosevelt in person, he was staying at the White House. And at night, Churchill was in a bedroom, and Roosevelt knocks on the door, and the door is opened by someone else other than Churchill. Describe that scene.
Yeah, so this is after this is at the end of the book when Churchill and company go to Washington D.C. This is after Pearl Harbor, after America has declared war on Germany, and likewise Germany's declared war on America. America's declared war on Japan. Japan's declared war on America. Now Britain and the United States are firm allies. The thing Churchill has wanted above all in this first year of his prime ministry is for Roosevelt to enter the war, for America to enter the war as a belligerent. So they're in D.C. and Roosevelt invites Churchill to stay in the White House. So Churchill is in his room. His bodyguard Walter Thompson is in there with him. He's omnipresent, that bodyguard. There's a knock at the door. Thompson goes to the door, opens it, and sees Roosevelt outside the door in his wheelchair. And Roosevelt looks past him and gets this curious look on his face. And Thompson is sort of wondering what that's about. Roosevelt starts to wheel his chair backward away from the door. Thompson turns and sees that Churchill is stark naked, holding a cocktail in that room. And Churchill says to the president, I'm going to fracture this quote, but Churchill says to the president, says, you may come in. As you can see, I am hiding nothing from the President of the United States.
There are examples like that throughout the book, but let's go back to the beginning. How did Churchill become prime minister?
Churchill became prime minister after there was a rebellion in the House of Commons against Neville Chamberlain, who there was the concern was that he was just not up to the challenge of managing the war. He was a very staid guy. His heart was in the right place, but people had after appeasement had sort of blown up in his face, if you will. There was a lot of inclination for just trying to get Chamberlain out of office. By the way, his nicknames, Neville Chamberlain's nicknames were the Coroner and the Old Umbrella, which gives you a sense of his style of management. So he essentially was kicked out by a revolt in the House of Commons and was appointed by the King on May 10, 1940. I should note that at the time he was appointed, a lot of people in Whitehall, a lot of ministers and so forth, did not want him to be prime minister. They didn't think he was a terribly good choice, and the King did not particularly want him to be prime minister. But he went with what the rebels wanted, and Churchill. This was the happiest day, honestly, of Churchill's life, even though that morning Hitler invaded the Low Countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, and so forth. And I think most people that I can imagine taking on a new job would think that was the nightmare scenario. But to Churchill, this was amazing. He was becoming prime minister, the thing he always wanted all his life. And not only that, he got to run the war. He got to direct this cataclysmic event, which thrilled him.
As you said, Churchill became prime minister in May of 1940. Germany had just invaded the Low Countries, and France. France fell in June 1940, and that's when Germany turned its attention to Britain.
Yes.
Hitler didn't think that Britain would fight. Why?
Hitler, the Germans throughout this youth had a curious impression. It was like they wanted to believe what they wanted to believe, which of course is a classic feeling of inept leadership. They felt that Churchill surely would give in, that he would come to the peace table, and Hitler was actually willing to negotiate because Hitler had aspirations elsewhere. But Churchill was defiant. He would not give in. He would not give in to that wicked man, which astounded Hitler and astounded Hitler's top hand. One thing I want to point out, by the way, in terms of the fall of France is how we forget today, perhaps, but the fall of France was a monumental occurrence in terms of how British strategy, British expectations of the war have been structured. France was considered an infallible bulwark against the Germans, and because of that, there was this prevailing belief that the Luftwaffe would never pose a really serious threat against Britain because the bombers would have to fly too far from Germany to get to Britain. When France fell, this was monumental because suddenly you had German forces on the Channel coast. You had German air bases on the Channel coast, literally minutes from the English coastline on the Channel, and literally minutes from London.
One of Churchill's first tests as prime minister after France fell, is dealing with the French naval fleet. Now, remember, these are two allies, France and Great Britain. Yes. Describe what, and you talk about leadership, describe the decision that Churchill had to make when it came to the French naval fleet.
Yeah, so the French Navy was actually quite a modern, large force, and Churchill's fear was that with the fall of France, that if this fleet fell into Hitler's hands, the balance of power on the seas would change completely, and that certainly would have been the case. He made a decision that the French ships had to be seized by British forces. And if they resisted, then they would have to deal with a forcible seizure by the British Navy. So this operation unfolded, Operation Catapult, and it went essentially fine elsewhere. But at the French base in the Mediterranean, at Mers el Kabir and the secondary base Oran, it seemed like the French were resisting. The Churchill dispatched a powerful naval force called Force H to offer to take the French on as allies, but also to issue an ultimatum that if they did not, that the British fleet was going to attack. This is a very tense moment. Now the decision to actually have this force sail to Mers el Kabir and to present these ultimatums was a wrenching one for Churchill. The night before, he actually had to summon one of his top advisors, Lord Beaverbrook, who was, one of his great strengths one of Churchill's great strengths as a leader was that he brought in advisors who he could trust to tell him the real deal, to tell him the truth. He knew that they could be really difficult in terms of shaking up the hierarchy and causing problems with other ministries and so forth, but he wanted to get the truth was. So on this night before this attack, before the fleet is authorized to sail to Mers el Kabir and issue this ultimatum, it's kind of a scary, windy night in London, 10 Downing Street, and Churchill is trying to decide what to do, and Beaverbrook affirms that this is, in fact, the thing to do. So the next day, the fleet issues the ultimatum. It first offers the French a hand, saying, please join us as allies. The French are clearly stalling. Their ships are firing up steam. They're getting ready to sail. The bridges are staffed, and it becomes very apparent that they are not going to willingly join the British as allies. Then comes this incredibly difficult decision by the admiral on the scene to attack the French fleet with all the force at their disposal. And this was an incredibly hard thing for Churchill, for the naval officers involved on these ships. Moments after the fuselage begins, a large French battleship just blows up and simply disappears from the sea. It's with a loss of, I think it was well over 1,000 sailors, most of course young men. Very wrenching decision, but also one actually that I think is sometimes forgotten for its intensity and for its importance in the run up actually to the Blitz, because it was that moment that the British, that Churchill really persuaded America and really started persuading Hitler that they were in this fight for the long haul. They were not going to come to the peace table, and persuading Roosevelt that if he gave aid to Churchill, to Britain, it would be well used.
So then Hitler and Germany turned their attention toward Britain. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's closest aides and head of the Luftwaffe, thought that Germany, with just air power, would be able to take over, I shouldn't say take over, but would be able to win the Battle of Britain in 4 days. In fact, they had grandstands erected in Berlin for a victory parade.
Right.
Oh, yeah, what you described a little bit earlier, Germans miscalculating, that almost sounds like arrogance.
Well, it was arrogant, but it was also people. It's hard to imagine now, but people had made assumptions about the power of bombing, the power of air power. It was still a novel thing. There had been bombing raids over England by German biplane bombers, by German dirigibles, but they had never been a massive sort of part of the German war effort against Britain. Comes World War II, and now aircraft are more advanced, bombs are bigger and more powerful. The belief was that now we could lead in Germany the Luftwaffe. Now they could deploy these forces in a way that conceivably could change the nature of the war completely. They had this faith that this might actually happen. Now, it turned out not to be the case, certainly not in those initial phases of the war, but that was the belief that bombers conceivably could prevail and solve the problem. And certainly it benefited Hermann Goering to promote this idea to Hitler because everybody wanted to suck up to Hitler, if you're pardon my French. If in fact Goering had succeeded in this, he would have been his star would have risen even higher than it already was with Hitler. I should note, by the way, in terms of the hierarchy, that Hitler was number one, the official number two was Rudolf Hess, but the man who Hitler really felt would be his successor was Hermann Goering, who also, by the way, was utterly corrupt and ran at the same time as all this was going on an immense criminal network aimed at stealing art.
In the book, you do learn a lot about Hitler, his decision-making, and the people who are just under him. From the very beginning, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but from the very beginning, when Churchill would be making decisions, a lot of them were geared toward the United States, toward Franklin Roosevelt. Describe that.
Well, let's put it this way: that just about every decision he made with an eye to America, Franklin Roosevelt, because very early in the war, I mean, not even early in the war, literally from the day he became prime minister, he understood that Britain might be able to hold off Germany, might be able to fight to a stalemate until more significant aid arrived from elsewhere, but could not prevail, could not win without the active participation of the United States. He understood from the very beginning. In fact, there's a scene where he is at Admiralty House, where he was living initially before taking over 10 Downing Street. He is shaving in his room in the morning. He's shaving, and his son Randolph is sitting behind him, and we're talking about the outcome of the war. And Randolph is telling his father, he's saying, I don't see how you can possibly expect to win this war. Yes, maybe you can, as I said, maybe you can fight this to a stalemate. I don't see how you can possibly win. To which Churchill throws his razor in the sink, whirls around, and faces Randolph and says, "I shall drag the United States in." And thus began a courtship of Roosevelt and America that Churchill himself later described in sort of a lover's terms, and I'm fracturing this quote, but said something to the effect that no lover ever pursued the target of his affection as ardently as I.
Now, remember, I'm speaking to the audience here, that we're talking about the period of 1940 and 1941, well before Pearl Harbor. What was the United States? What was the attitude toward war in the United States at that time?
Well, the United States public was adamantly opposed to getting involved. Roosevelt had an appreciation of the fact that involvement was probably going to be inevitable at some point, but really had to gauge whether America did something like that very, very, very carefully because the public was so opposed. It was also the case that Roosevelt was on the verge of declaring himself a candidate for an unprecedented third term as president. He had not yet early on done so, but did not do so until quite late in the campaign electoral process. But it was a very ticklish situation for Roosevelt to to get close to Britain, even to give too much aid to Britain, would have seemed to some to have been a violation of this need for isolation.
At first, Hitler signaled that he didn't want London bombed. London was bombed by mistake, but take us to September 7th, 1940. What happened?
Yeah, so that background actually is important. I mean, Hitler explicitly banned the bombing of central London because, again, he wanted to try to bring he wanted to try to bring Churchill to the negotiating table, so that he could remove England as a Britain as a second front behind him as he turned his attentions to the east. So it was very important to Hitler then to not risk bombing central London and so galvanizing opposition that Churchill would never ever come to the table. Now it's important though to recognize, you mentioned the bombing by mistake, which is a very important part of the equation. On August 24th, 1940, a group of German bombers got lost, dropped their bombs over what they thought was their target, but was in fact central London. This was a mistake. Of course, the British did not know it was a mistake. It was a terrifying thing. Hitler knew it was a mistake. Hermann Goering knew it was a mistake, and dispatched an order to the bomber base that those who were involved were going to henceforth be transferred to the infantry. And this was how serious they were about all this stuff. The importance of that mistake was that it gave Churchill the moral justification to send bombers to Berlin, and thus began this ratcheting up process, which led to that first catastrophic, deliberate bombing of London by the Luftwaffe on September 7, 1940. And what then followed again, just to remind everybody, was 57 consecutive nights of bombing.
The bombing became routine almost for the British. From that very first night of bombing, though, you had talked earlier about how the Brits were inspired, or morale seemed to go up. And that's hard to believe, that there was a blackout, complete blackout of London, that you write in the book, that's what people hated the most. They didn't even say the bombing is what they hated the most. They hated the blackout more than anything else. But from that first night on, morale went up as the bombing continued. 400 people killed in that first bomb. Goering couldn't understand why the Luftwaffe wasn't being more successful. As I said earlier, he thought it'd be over in 4 days. Why wasn't it more successful?
Well, it wasn't more successful simply because bombing at that time, they did not have the firepower. They did not have the heavy long-range bombers equipped with tons and tons of bombs necessary to level a place like London. It was not this phase not in this phase of the war. That kind of bombing, this really intensive bombing, came later in the war, mainly conducted by the Allies against German cities. But at this phase of the war, bombing simply was not. It was not as effective as the Germans believed it to be. They believed that night after night like this, London would have been a sea of flames, and that certainly Churchill would have capitulated somewhere halfway through the process. But it didn't happen.
No, it was a sea of flames on many nights, but as I said, the morale seemed to go up.
Yeah, but important to note though that London is and was a very large city, and neighborhoods would become engulfed in flames and would experience significant destruction. And the Luftwaffe told its pilots and crews that they should expect to see the entire city of London in flames. But this proved not to be the case. And when German bomber crews would fly over London and realize that it was not a sea of flames, they actually began to become quite disillusioned that they were being told something that was simply not the case. But anyway, go ahead.
the entire time that the bombing is going on, as you mentioned, over 57 nights, but especially at maybe halfway through, Churchill thought that a German invasion of the British Isles was a real possibility. Why didn't Hitler launch an invasion against Great Britain?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that Churchill believed that Hitler was deeply uneasy about anything having to do with an amphibian attack. An amphibian attack, of course, sorry, by the way, that is not what you might fear it is. This is like a dry throat. Thank you. But no, ask that question again. I got sidetracked.
Yeah, why Hitler decided against invading Great Britain?
Yeah, so Hitler understood, I think, the realities of what would be involved in that in a way that perhaps his high command did not, although the high command was worried as well. Trying to launch an invasion across the channel when you had a minimal navy, which was the case with Germany, had the potential for catastrophe. And this is why it was so important for Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe to neutralize the RAF, because one thing was certain, and that was that no invasion could succeed if the RAF still had air superiority. By the same token, Churchill recognized very early on that the same concept, that the only way that Germany would be able to conduct a successful invasion was if they acquired air superiority. And he understood from the very beginning that the only way to deny them that superiority was through the production and deployment of fighter planes, of RAF fighter planes. Bombers at that point didn't matter in terms of the defense of Britain. They were useful for other means. What really mattered was fighters to oppose the British bombers and fighters to oppose the German bombers and the German fighters which were so necessary to escort those bombers. He understood that from the very beginning, and in fact, one of his smartest moves was appointing Lord Beaverbrook. He's the advisor I mentioned earlier. Right after Churchill became Prime Minister, he appointed Lord Beaverbrook to be his Minister of Aircraft Production, to shake up the aircraft industry and ramp up production of aircraft. And luckily, happily, Beaverbrook was the right man for the job, and really did almost a magical job in ramping up production, which was crucial for defending Britain, for helping to prevent this invasion that was deemed by many to be a certain.
At the same time, Hitler was turning his eyes eastward as well, yes, toward the Soviet Union, Russia. That he, was planning an invasion of Russia at the same time, and thought that, he thought that this would be something that would last only a few months, and then that he could turn his attention back to Great Britain. Right. How much of that decision, I don't want to say saved England, but at the same time, he had a two-front war and divided attention.
Well, how much of that saved England? It's always hard to weigh that. I mean, I wasn't that privy to what was going on in Hitler's mind. I don't think anybody else really was, but it's very clear that this fear of a two-front war was important to an important part of Hitler's thinking ever since even the 1920s. But when obviously he did not think, obviously Hitler and his generals did not think that the invasion of the Soviet Union would become the fiasco that it did. As you mentioned, they thought this would end very quickly, and then they would have time and opportunity to turn back their attentions back to Great Britain. Did not turn out that way for a lot of compelling reasons, but that's certainly what they expected.
One of the unique parts of your book is that it is not just a war story. I mean, the war dominates everything in the book, but you write not just about Churchill, not just about Hitler, not just about Goering, but Churchill's family, his daughter Mary, his youngest daughter Mary, his son Randolph, his wife Clementine, and a lot of his secretaries, the people around him. and these people are interesting, fascinating in themselves. Who did you like the most in the book? I mean, who? Yeah, Mary seemed, and I got the sense that what was a great help was the diaries that they left.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, my favorite character, hands down. I mean, you make the exception of Churchill, but my favorite secondary character, if you will, was Mary Churchill, Churchill's daughter, Churchill's youngest surviving daughter, Mary Churchill, who was 17 at the time he became prime minister, turns 18, of course, that first year of his premiership. She, to me, was a wonderful presence in the book, and I am so lucky to have been given permission to read her diary by her mother's by her chain of events. But anyway, I was very lucky to be given permission to read this diary because, and at the time I got permission, by the way, I was one of 2 scholars apparently who had been given permission. This diary is so revelatory because, first of all, while she was 17, she was a very smart, articulate, acute observer of everything around her, and also had this deep adoration for her father. But at the same time, she was, after all, a 17-year-old girl, and she wanted to have fun, and she did. Her parents, Winston and Clementine, parked her at Checkers at the country estate for safekeeping. She didn't like being stuck out there. She wanted to get back to London. She wanted to be a part of the war. But while she was out there and she was making observations in her diaries and so forth, she also had a great time with these RAF pilots with dances, and she and her friends would go to dances, and she makes periodic reference to coming back for bouts of snogging in the hayloft, that kind of thing. So she was just this lively presence and this lovely counterpoint to the war, but also this sort of one woman Greek chorus describing things that were unfolding as the war advanced. But she also had her own drama that unfolded in the course of that time as well, an emotional drama, and that to me is very important. It's all part of powering the story.
Scott, just real quick, we'll wrap up in like 5 minutes, then we'll go to the audience questions.
Okay, all right. I have to describe one night when there was a particularly bad bombing going on. Mary, as you said, I think she was 18 at this time, had turned 18. Hitler ordered one big raid on London before the invasion of Russia. It was in retribution for the Brits having bombed a few cities in Germany. That raid on London killed 1,436 people, or excuse me, that night, it was that night that there were 1,436 people injured, 1,792. Now, Mary was at a debutante ball that night. I may have got them mixed up. You can correct me here.
But that wasn't the last raid.
Okay, that wasn't the last one. But the one that Mary was at the debutante ball, while bombs were going off outside, they hear the gunfire. After the ball, they plan to go to another dance, another place that had been destroyed by bombing. 34 people killed. They turned around and went to another club and danced until 6:30. Now, some people would hear that and say, well, she was kind of shallow, wasn't she? Didn't have a whole lot of empathy.
Well, she addresses that actually in her diary. She addresses the fact that she felt a little guilty about going on to the and they talked about going on to this other club after the club that they were supposed to go to had been destroyed. And they came to the decision that, the people who had died in that raid, they would have advocated that they go on, they live their lives, that they go forward. I mean, that to me is a very, very, very compelling scene for a number of reasons. First of all, Mary that night was at the annual debutante ball, Queen Charlotte's ball, held in the underground dining room. As they're there, a raid begins, and they continue the dance. This is the kind of adjustment that Londoners had made. And it was after that they set out for the Café de Paris and learned that this horrific bombing had occurred. And then went on to, of course, dance the night away elsewhere.
Now, I want to make sure that I clarify, get my raids accurate here. But Britain had suffered a series of defeats on the battlefields of the Middle East, and they were losing ground in other places. Winston Churchill was really down at this point. I mean, the guy had a charismatic personality. He seemed to be happy all the time, if he could be happy during war. But at this point in his life, in this period, he was really down.
Well, he was down at intervals, but Churchill was, one of the things that impressed me about Churchill also was his ability to rouse himself from that, his ability to put things into compartments. He would, at least in terms of the research that I did, my experience of Churchill was that he was never down for long. He was prone to bouts of periodic depression, referred to him as the Black Dog. But he was pretty adept, I feel, at rousing himself from those bouts. Again, he had a tremendous sense of fun. It was not unusual for him to be down in the dumps one moment, maybe have a little champagne with dinner, start a nice conversation, and the next thing you know, everything's happy again. I mean, this is a guy who could keep things, I feel, could keep perspective.
Now I want to get to that raid I was talking
Okay.
about. One of the last big raids of the war, as Hitler is planning the invasion of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
This was the one where there were 1,436 people killed in London, 1,792 that were seriously injured. Talk about this raid. It was what you described as the worst one of the war.
So you're talking about the one on May 10, 1941.
Right.
Yeah, this was a particularly significant raid. It seemed vengeful. It also seemed to have been targeted at Churchill. There was the fear throughout this year that the Luftwaffe was actually beginning to target Churchill specifically, and this raid certainly seemed to suggest that was happening. The bombs tended to fall most intensely in the Whitehall area, and took out a lot of really important British treasures. But interestingly, this raid, went on through the night, May 10th. The next morning, people awoke to a very quiet, quite beautiful day. Parts of the city were still engulfed in flames, but what was really remarkable was that the raid, there was this sense of quiet that persisted into the next day. There was not another raid, despite perfect weather for raids. There wasn't a raid the next day. There wasn't a raid the next day, and not the next day. This first major assault by the Luftwaffe, the most important one probably of the war, these aerial assaults by the Luftwaffe against Britain, had come to an end. Had come to an end on May 10, 1941, and constituted really the first victory of the war, if you will, because Britain had not capitulated. Churchill had not capitulated. They had withstood this attack.
And I just want to go from September 7th, 1940 to May 11th, 1941. 29,000 people killed in London, 25,556 injured. For the United Kingdom, 44,652 people killed, 52,770 injured, including of those that were killed, 5,626 children killed.
Yes.
Now, I hate to just read numbers and casualties, but I wonder whether people realize how serious, how much violence was included in the Battle of Britain, and Britain was able to survive.
Yeah. Well, I can't speak for how people at large, feel about that or understood about that, but I certainly did not. I had no perception of the depth of disruption and death and so forth in the course of this period. And again, it's not just, there are different phases to the process of the Battle of Britain, where the Luftwaffe tried to take out the RAF and British aircraft industries. Then there's the Blitz, which is these 57 nights of intensive bombing. And then there's this other 6-month period from then on to May 10, 1941, May 10, 1941. This was to me is unfathomable how anybody could could have endured it. And that was, again, that's why I decided to explore this book, just to understand, try to understand how people were able to do this. And I got a real insight into this. There's this. I think this is a metaphor for the whole process. And maybe after this we can take some questions. There was this outfit called Mass Observation that was created before the war actually began. The point being to try to get a handle on what ordinary British life was like. And they recruited hundreds of diarists just to write about the most mundane things in their lives. The war arrives, many of these continued to write their diaries. And one of these diarists was a young woman named Olivia Cockett, who I very much love. I see her sort of as tracking the experience of Londoners at large. Here's this raid, September 7, 1940, the first intense deliberate raid. She's terrified, as so many other Londoners are, just absolutely terrified. The terror persists for a time. Then one day, an incendiary bomb lands outside her home. An incendiary bomb being these were typically the first bombs that the Germans would drop, the idea being to set fire to things so that there would be fires to guide the bombers that would follow. So one of these incendiary bombs lands outside her home, and she puts it out. She puts this bomb out, and she suddenly feels incredibly emboldened. She feels like she is no longer a passive victim to the Luftwaffe, and her courage just continues to grow after that. To the point where one day she's walking with her boyfriend, she's walking during a raid, again, as one does. She's walking during a raid. Her boyfriend, who had instead become increasingly frightened, he shouts to her to get down. She says, "Not in my new coat, I'm not."
Alex, so we want to get some questions from those who are tuning in.
Absolutely. We'll now go to the audience Q&A. So, Erik, the first question I'm going to read is from Terry. They ask, please share a little bit about your writing and research process. How do you decide what topics or eras to write about?
Yeah. You got another couple hours. I can talk about that. My how I decide on my next project is, it's honestly, it's the toughest part of what I do, because an idea, in order to be amenable to how I like to write history, it has to meet a lot of very important criteria. One of which is that it has to have a very clear narrative arc or engine. That is to say, it has to be a real life story that can lend itself to being retold as a story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But then, most important after that is that there has to be a very deep, rich archive of a reservoir of archival materials, fine-grained archival materials, because you can't do this kind of history if you don't. As to what ideas I eventually settle on, I mean, honestly, I wish I could boil it down to a process, because it typically comes down to accident. A question will enter my mind, like in this case, it's like, how could anybody possibly have endured that German campaign? And just thinking, yeah, maybe I'll explore that. Anyway, that's the short form version.
So this one is from Mark. I'm sure the research effort had to be monumental, but what did you find to be the single most significant source of information for your book?
Oh, very good question. Yeah, the research on this thing was monumental, more monumental than I had expected, actually, setting out. Fools rush in, where angels fear to tread. But I think the most useful to me, and this has been the case I've seen in a number of my books, is honestly the National Archives of the UK. What a place! It's in Kew. If you take the subway out and make a right, you go to Kew Gardens. If you make a left, you can make your way to the archive. It just has everything. It has everything, and it's so, once you get the hang of it, it's so easy to use, and the files are so rich. That was the single most important source. Although I will also say that the U.S. Library of Congress, the manuscript division, proved to be surprisingly valuable in this, because of the American side of the story, because of the emissaries who were sent by Roosevelt to London, because of Adolf Churchill's very somewhat unhappy wife, Pamela Churchill. Her papers are there. Pamela Churchill Harriman, as many would know her better now. But I would say the archives of the UK were the single most.
This next question is from Jared. He writes, World War II historian Richard Overy recently wrote that wartime leaders disguised the awful reality of being bombed with tales of British resolve, and its template of heroics is not a fitting one for combating the coronavirus. Do you agree or disagree?
He's saying that like Churchill's, repeat that question.
Sure. So he says, World War II historian Richard Overy recently wrote that wartime leaders disguised the awful reality of being bombed with tales of British resolve, and this template of heroics is not a fitting one for combating the coronavirus. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, first of all, Overy is a fantastic historian of the Battle of Britain. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are. It's a danger to draw too many parallels between the Blitz period and what we're dealing with now in terms of the COVID virus, in part because the nature of the enemy is obviously the nature of the enemy is so very different. For one thing, what heroics you're fighting? You're fighting an invisible pathogen. You can't strap on a bulletproof vest and go out there and say, okay, I'm sick of this. I'm going to go quash that virus. We do what we can do. We isolate ourselves, and we hope that that's going to be the thing that works for us. But there too, it's very, very different because, the British. One of the hallmarks of the Blitz was that life went on. As we talked about, you could go to parties, you could go out dancing. The social aspect of life, the thing that helps people steel themselves, perhaps the most, was intact and was very much alive and vibrant thing. The particularly cruel thing about fighting the coronavirus, if you will, is that we have to do it all alone. For some people, literally all alone. We got caught at the particular phase in their lives where this has thrown them completely for this anomie-inducing solitude. So they're very different. So I wouldn't disagree.
This next question is from someone with the initials of DRF. They say, has there been a world leader since Churchill that you think shared his leadership strengths?
Has there been a world leader since Churchill? I'm not up on every world leader, so I can't really. I don't think I can really answer that in a smart way. I mean, I can talk about some leaders that I feel were Churchillian. I mean, I think that Roosevelt was a very, very, very fine leader, and I think if you go back in the past, you'll find others as well. But I'm not I'm not an expert on world leaders. I've become kind of a little expert on a certain kind of leadership, but not on the history of it.
This next question is from Tracy. They say, reading about Churchill's leadership and the courage of the British people was inspirational, especially in these times. They go on to ask, what was Churchill's views on the extermination of the Jewish people?
Wow, that's a radical change of the conversation from leadership to his views on the extermination of the Jews. I again, even there, I am not qualified to discuss that. So because I frankly don't know much about it, but I can tell you a lot about Churchill and leadership in the Blitz and how he might have conducted himself today.
This next question is from Scott. They write, every book of yours, there's a place I end up fascinated by that I didn't know about before. In this book, it was, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Checkers. Did you have any idea it was going to be so central to the story? Did you get to visit it yourself?
I did. First of all, I did not actually get to visit Checkers. It's a very difficult place to visit because it is, in fact, an active prime ministerial abode. But I became fascinated with Checkers. I did not know about Checkers. I did not expect it to become such a potent presence in the book when I started in. But it really became almost a character in itself. I became enthralled with the details about the property, about how Churchill used it, its importance to him, in figuring out how. Yeah, I mean, funny thing about Chequers is that Chequers, when it was deeded to the government in 1917 by Arthur Lee, an American who actually owned this place, when it was deeded to the government, the point was that Chequers was not to be used for work. It was a place where you were just to go because it was to be a haven to restore prime ministerial mental health. Churchill, of course, being Churchill, he used it in a very different way. This was his country command post. He packed it with guests every weekend. There were lunches and dinners and wine and strategy talks and so forth. So it really did become a very important part of the story for me, and clearly it was a very important part of the story for him.
This next question is from Phil. Phil says, what is the most surprising historical document you stumbled upon during the research for the book?
Nice. The most surprising historical documents. I'm running through a lot in my head, and I guess the most surprising, honestly, was Mary Churchill's diary. That to me is the best and most delightful. I love that. Although, actually, now that you mention it, there's another thing that I was really surprised by. I was delighted with, actually. Everybody knows, everybody who's written Churchill, about Churchill, knows about John Colville, one of his cadre of private secretaries. And John Colville kept a really fantastic daily diary of things happening in 10 Downing Street, and it was subsequently published actually as a book, which anybody can read, and I urge you to do so. It's terrific. It's called The Fringes of Power. It's fantastic. And it's very, very well written. And it is actually, as published, it is actually the diary, very much the diary that is in the archives at the Churchill Archive Center at Churchill College in Cambridge. But I was interested in Colville. To me, Colville has always been a secondary character in books, not even secondary character, but sort of an off-camera character in books that have been written about Churchill. And it seemed to me that Colville wanted to step forward and become an actual character. So I started looking into Colville. One day, kind of on a whim, when I was at the Churchill Archive Center, I decided to compare the published diary with the unpublished diary. And in so doing, I found the things that to me were the most valuable, the most telling. Colville had dismissed these in his introduction to his published diary as trivialities, and that's why he cut them from the published diary. But believe me, these things at the time were not trivialities. These were front and center. These were the things that mattered most because he was in love. He was in love with this young woman, Gay Margison. It was an unrequited love. She liked him, but he really wanted to marry her. She would not do so. And to me, this had a lot of pathos because here you are in the midst of this war, bombs falling left and right. Of course, you still fall in love and you still get jilted and you still feel bad. And that to me was very important. So that was very surprising.
So we do have to wrap up shortly. So we're going to end on two final questions, and they're just two softballs here. Have you chosen your next topic? And if so, can you give us any clues as to what it might be?
You might have to take three questions because no, I have not chosen. I have not chosen my next subject. So ask me another.
All right. The next one along those lines. What are you reading right now? Any upcoming releases you are excited about?
Oh, I'll tell you what I'm reading right now. I read for when I'm by day I read nonfiction, but for entertainment by night I read for pleasure. I read strictly fiction, and I love a good thriller. I love a good distraction thriller, especially in a time like this. And I'm reading one that I just love it, and it's called The Couple Next Door by Shari Lapina. I recommend it to anybody who loves a good thriller.
It's one of our bestsellers. It's a good pick. So we'll go with one last question, and this one is from Chriso, and it is: do you think a leader like Churchill could be successful today? Why or why not?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, I do think a leader like Churchill could be successful today because I think the techniques of leadership, the leadership style that he evoked certainly during this period that I write about, I think that those techniques, those tactics, that way of leading are translatable to any era. I mean, perhaps with some modifications. Churchill was a guy who would write speeches that would go on for 10 very articulate pages, and maybe the contemporary audience is not that willing to listen to that. Although with a guy like Churchill, you might settle in with a glass of wine and listen because he was so compelling. But when you distill the techniques, the aspects of leadership that he evinced in that era, yeah, I think they would translate very well, actually exceptionally well to right now. I mean, what I'd like to hear from the White House, I'd like to hear a classic Churchill speech, not talking now about the rhetorical flourishes that were so fabulous that we all know about, blood, sweat, and tears, and so much owed by so many to so few. Those are fantastic lines, and we're very good at that. But there's something more about his speeches that would be very, very compelling for today. I did a lot of reading into his speeches and their structure. And the way he did it was he would begin with a sober assessment of the situation, no sugarcoating, a sober assessment of the situation, the real deal, what he understood it to be. And then he would follow with reasons for optimism, real reasons for optimism, not happy talk, not some imaginary thing coming down the pike, but real reasons for optimism. Some element or elements that would give one hope that we could eventually get this thing under control. And then would come the rhetorical flourish. Then would come the ending of the speech, where he would craft something that would metaphorically or literally make people rise from their seats and charge out into the streets and say, okay, I'm emboldened, I'm going to take this on. Now, I'm not saying that today that would be necessarily a good thing. We'd have to charge out of our seats emboldened and stand 6 feet away from each other. But the psychic power of something like that would be very useful, I feel, at this point.
So I want to thank Erik and thank you, Scott, for joining us here this evening. We do have to wrap it up. So I really appreciate you extending your time with us and sharing your thoughts on the book. To everyone out there, if you have not purchased a signed copy, we still have signed copies available. Just click the link below. We're going to get those books out to you as soon as possible, hopefully tomorrow, but at the latest Friday. I'll leave it up to Scott and Erik for the last word.
Thank you. This was great. Shape of things to come, at least short term.
Let's hope it's just short term. But Erik, thank you very much. I have to say, I was saying this to Erik before we even went on, that I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I have to say that it's up there at the top of my list of amongst my favorites now.
Thank you, and thank you, Alex. This is great.
Yeah, everyone, stay safe and stay home.
Thanks for tuning in too. Yeah.